What is it that drives a teenage peasant girl, born in obscurity, to change the course of kingdoms? How could a young woman with no noble blood, no military training, and no worldly power stand before kings and captains and claim to carry a divine mission? Was she a saint chosen by God, a visionary aflame with faith, or a dangerous fanatic caught in the storm of war? This is the extraordinary story of Joan of Arc, the Maid of Orleans. From her humble village of Domrémy to the thundering battlefields of the 100 Years' War, from her triumphant role in the coronation of Charles VII, had Reims to her harrowing trial and martyrdom at Rouen. Joan's short life reshaped France and shook Europe to its core. Her courage inspired soldiers, her faith unsettled scholars, and her defiance threatened kings. Even in death, she refused to be silenced. Burned at the stake at 19, yet rising as a legend that centuries could not destroy. Joan of Arc remains one of the most compelling figures in world history. But who was she truly? A heavenly messenger, a girl of unyielding conviction, or a tragic pawn of politics and war? To answer, we must follow her journey through visions and victories, betrayals and trials, a path that would transform a simple peasant into a saint and carve her name forever into history.
What is it that compels a 17-year-old girl, born into obscurity in a remote village, to stand before soldiers, seasoned captains, and even a king, and persuade them that she carries a divine mission? What kind of power allows a peasant maiden, with neither fine armor nor sharpened blade, to turn the course of a kingdom's fate? Was it truly a miracle, a vision granted by God, or a collective illusion later enshrined by history as legend? To grasp the figure of Jeanne d'Arc, Joan of Arc to the English tongue, we must return to the 15th century, to one of the bloodiest and most protracted conflicts in European history, the 100 Years' War. Despite its name, it was not a single unbroken century of combat, but a series of campaigns, truces, betrayals, and battles stretching from 1337 to 1453, as England and France, alongside their shifting allies, vied for supremacy. By the early 15th century, France appeared on the verge of collapse. The English had conquered vast swathes of the north, including Normandy. In 1415, at the fateful field of Agincourt, French chivalry had been humbled beneath a rain of English arrows. The Treaty of Troyes, signed in 1420, stripped the Dauphin Charles, the rightful heir of the Valois line, of his claim, and instead recognized Henry V of England as heir to the French throne. France was cleft in two, the north and west largely under English control, while the south and center clung to Charles, a prince derided by many as weak, uncertain, and even illegitimate. The despair was palpable. Could France yet survive? Its commanders were weary, its nobility fractured, its people dispirited. In this desperate hour, the most unlikely of figures emerged. A peasant girl from Domrémy, scarcely more than a child, who declared that heavenly voices had commanded her to rescue France and to place the Dauphin upon his rightful throne. Picture, if you will, the scene. You are a battle-hardened captain, long accustomed to blood and dust, when suddenly a young girl appears, dressed not in silks or jewels, but in the plain garb of the countryside. She insists that God himself has chosen her to lead men-at-arms. Would you laugh? Would you dismiss her as mad? Or would you find yourself unsettled by the fire in her eyes, by the strange conviction in her words? History records that at first she was met with derision. Yet, step by step, with a tenacity bordering on the miraculous, she began to win belief. Joan's tale is not merely an episode in a dynastic quarrel. It is one of the clearest demonstrations of how faith and symbol can wield as much force as sword and lance. She was small, unlettered, and, by every worldly measure, insignificant. Yet she became the embodiment of a nation's will to endure. Was this Then, truly the triumph of divine providence, or was it rather a human tragedy dressed in the raiment of sanctity? In the chapters ahead, we shall follow Joan's footsteps, from her quiet village life in Domrémy, through the thunder of battle at Orléans, to the merciless trial at Rouen, and finally to the pyre that transformed her into a martyr. It is a journey at once sacred and tragic, a story that has never ceased to haunt the European imagination. In order to comprehend the extraordinariness of Joan's destiny, we must begin not with the clangor of battle or the pomp of courts, but with the stillness of the French countryside. Domrémy, her birthplace, was a small, unassuming village on the borderlands between Champagne and Lorraine. In the early 15th century, it was little more than a cluster of cottages surrounded by fields, orchards, and meadows, a place where daily life was measured by the rhythms of the church bell, the sowing of seed, and the gathering of harvest. It was here, in 1412, that Jeanne was born to Jacques d'Arc, a farmer of modest means, and his wife, Isabelle Romée. They were not destitute, nor were they in any way grand. They tilled their land, tended their cattle, and like most peasants of their station, their lives revolved around the parish and its priest. Young Jean, the third of 5 children, grew up amidst these rustic labors, learning to spin and sew, to mind the animals, and to help her mother in the keeping of the household. From the testimony of her neighbors many years later, we learn that Jeanne was devout beyond her age. While other children played, she would slip away to pray at the little chapel of St. Catherine, a short walk from Domrémy. Those who knew her spoke of her kindness, her modesty, and an unusual intensity in her eyes, as though she saw more than others. Yet in those days, nothing marked her out as destined for renown. She was, to all appearances, a simple peasant girl. But the world beyond Domrémy was anything but simple. The region lay upon a fault line of the 100 Years' War. From time to time, bands of marauding soldiers, Burgundian or English, would pass through, plundering villages, burning crops, and terrorizing peasants. The memory of violence was never far away, and stories of France's defeats reached even the most isolated hamlets. To grow up in such an atmosphere was to breathe fear and uncertainty. It was against this backdrop that Jeanne experienced what she would later call her voices. She was around 13 when she first heard them, while in her father's garden on a summer's day. A brilliant light appeared, she said, and with it the voice of Saint Michael the Archangel, commanding her to live a pure life and, in time, to take up a divine mission. Later, she claimed to have been visited as well by Saint Catherine of Alexandria and Saint Margaret of Antioch, both virgin martyrs of the early church. Imagine, for a moment, the impact of such visions upon a girl scarcely in her teens. Were they the product of fervent piety and a vivid imagination, stirred by the sermons of wandering preachers? Were they hallucinations, perhaps induced by hunger, fasting, or the stress of living amidst war? Or were they, as she steadfastly believed, genuine messengers from heaven? Whatever their source, they shaped her utterly. Jeanne was convinced she had been chosen for a divine purpose, to drive the English from France and to see the Dauphin crowned at Reims. For 4 years she kept her secret close, confiding in only a few, while the voices pressed her ever more insistently. Her resolve hardened, her certainty grew. And so, when the time came, she would leave Domrémy, that quiet cradle of her faith, and embark upon a journey that would confound kings, armies, and the chronicles of Europe. The voices that Jeanne heard did not remain vague or comforting whispers. As she grew older, they became ever more insistent, their message sharper, their command more direct. By the age of 16, they no longer spoke merely of purity or prayer. They spoke of action. They charged her with a task so audacious, so unthinkable, that to any ordinary mind it would have seemed madness. She was to rescue France from its enemies and ensure that Charles, the Dauphin, was crowned rightful king at Reims. At first, Jeanne resisted. She was a farmer's daughter, unlettered and unknown. What could she possibly do against the might of England, whose armies had humbled France time and again? Yet the voices gave her no peace. Again and again, St. Michael, St. Catherine, and St. Margaret urged her to act. She wept. She argued. She prayed for release, but the command remained the same. At length, she accepted what she believed to be God's will. It is easy, in the modern age, to doubt. Was it a case of youthful imagination inflamed by tales of saints and martyrs? Was it perhaps the consequence of a troubled mind, shaped by years of war and uncertainty? Or could it be, as many of her contemporaries believed, the unmistakable intervention of the divine? Whatever the truth, what matters for history is this: Jeanne believed. And belief, when carried with absolute conviction, can shake kingdoms. In 1428, the Voices gave her a specific command. She must seek out Robert de Baudricourt, the captain of the garrison at Vaucouleurs, and request his aid in reaching the Dauphin. To this grizzled veteran of the wars, Jeanne must have appeared a ridiculous figure. A teenage girl, clad in simple peasant dress, announcing that she was destined to save France. Unsurprisingly, he dismissed her. The soldiers mocked her. The townsfolk laughed. Yet Jeanne did not falter. She returned again and again, repeating her claim, never wavering until her persistence began to unsettle those around her. It was at this time that rumors began to spread through the district. People whispered of the Maid of Lorraine, prophesied by old songs and legends, who would arise to deliver France in its darkest hour. Some began to wonder if this peasant girl might indeed be the fulfillment of such prophecies. The age was one of deep credulity, but also of profound longing for deliverance. Hope clung to any sign, however faint, and Jeanne's unwavering certainty shone like a beacon in the gloom. Finally, after months of refusal, Baudricourt relented. Perhaps he was impressed by her resolve. Perhaps he simply tired of her persistence. In any case, he granted her a small escort to carry her to the Dauphin at Chinon. It was an extraordinary concession, one that would set the stage for one of history's most remarkable encounters. Thus, in February 1429, Jeanne departed Vaucouleurs, dressed in male attire for safety on the road, her hair cropped short beneath a cap, riding a horse like any squire. Before her lay a journey of nearly 300 miles through a land scarred by war. Behind her lay the fields and chapels of Domrémy, the innocence of childhood now forever abandoned. Ahead lay destiny. The journey from Vaucouleurs to Chinon was no simple ride across quiet meadows. France in 1429 was a fractured land, carved up by warring lords, occupied towns, and roaming bands of mercenaries who plundered without loyalty to either side. To travel nearly 300 miles across such terrain was dangerous even for seasoned soldiers. For a young peasant girl claiming to carry a divine mission, it was perilous indeed. Jeanne rode in male attire, not merely for disguise, but, as she insisted, for propriety. In her view, to wear the dress of a soldier was to shield her chastity against assault during the journey. Her hair was shorn, her bearing composed, and she rode with a gravity that belied her years. Those who traveled with her later testified to her composure. She neither wavered in prayer nor showed fear when danger loomed. At night, while others rested, she would kneel, whispering her petitions to the saints who had set her upon this path. When at last she reached Chinon, her task was far from complete. The Dauphin, Charles of Valois, was not a man easily persuaded. His court was filled with skeptics and cautious counselors, many of whom had already dismissed Jeanne as a harmless fanatic. They saw her as an embarrassment, a rustic distraction in a time that demanded sober strategy and resources. Yet Charles, beset by doubts and lacking confidence, hesitated. He agreed to see her, but only after contriving a test. According to the chroniclers, when Jeanne was admitted to the great hall at Chinon, Charles disguised himself, standing amongst his courtiers, while another man took the throne. The plan was to expose her ignorance. Surely, if she were truly guided by God, she would recognize the Dauphin. Jeanne entered, pausing only a moment, before she walked straight through the crowd to Charles himself. She knelt and addressed him as her rightful king. Whether this was divine insight, shrewd observation, or the whisper of a sympathetic insider, we cannot know, but the effect upon those present was profound. Charles, still uncertain, granted her further audiences. Clergy and scholars were summoned to interrogate her. For weeks she was examined by theologians at Poitiers, questioned about her visions, her faith, and her claim to divine mission. She endured their scrutiny with remarkable poise, answering in plain, unaffected speech. "I am but a poor maid," she declared, "but I am commanded by God." Her simplicity, combined with unshakable conviction, disarmed even the most suspicious. At length, the verdict was favorable. The examiners found no heresy in her words. If she were a fraud, they reasoned, time would soon expose her. If she were genuine, then perhaps God had indeed sent deliverance in so unexpected a guise. Charles, ever hesitant, was at last persuaded to allow her a chance. So it was that the maid of Domrémy, scarcely 17 years of age, was given armor, a white banner embroidered with the lilies of France, and command to accompany an army. Her mission, to lift the English siege of Orléans, a task that seasoned generals had failed to accomplish. It was an impossible charge, and yet Jeanne embraced it with a serenity that astonished all around her. When Jeanne arrived at Orléans in April 1429, the city had been under siege for months. It was the key to the Loire Valley, a bastion whose fall would have opened the heart of France to English conquest. Supplies were dwindling, morale was exhausted, and many believed that only a miracle could save the city. Into this despairing atmosphere rode a peasant girl clad in shining armor, carrying a banner of white silk embroidered with golden lilies and the sacred names of Jesus and Mary. The effect was immediate, if not universally convincing. Soldiers and townsfolk, long accustomed to the weary grimness of war, were stirred by her presence. Chroniclers record how she spoke to them with a calm authority, urging them to put aside vice, to confess their sins, and to trust in God. She forbade blasphemy and demanded discipline, reminding them that they were not merely fighting for territory, but for the soul of France. Some scoffed, others obeyed, but none could deny the strange sense of renewal that followed her arrival. Jeanne was not a strategist in the conventional sense. She did not pore over maps or debate tactics with her captains. Instead, she radiated conviction. While veteran commanders hesitated, she urged action. "Forward! In God's name!" she would cry, and the men found themselves swept along. Her courage was not reckless but unflinching. In one assault she was struck by an arrow, driven deep into her shoulder. She fell, but after a brief retreat to have the wound dressed, she returned to the fight, bearing her banner high. To those who saw her, it seemed as though the maid could not be vanquished. The Siege of Orléans reached its climax in early May. French forces, invigorated by Jeanne's presence, stormed the English fortifications one by one. On 7 May, they launched a final assault upon the stronghold of Les Tourelles. The fighting was brutal. English longbowmen rained death upon the attackers. Jeanne herself scaled a ladder to the walls, calling out encouragement even as arrows whistled around her. Struck and carried away, she returned again, limping but resolute. By nightfall, Les Tourelles had fallen. The next morning, the English lifted the siege and retreated. Orléans was free. News of the victory spread like wildfire. Across France, people spoke of the maid who had delivered them, of the miracle wrought by her faith. In Paris and Rouen, the English scoffed, insisting it was luck or coincidence. But amongst the French, the legend of Jeanne d'Arc was born. For the Dauphin Charles, still hesitant by nature, Orléans was a revelation. He could no longer dismiss the girl from Domrémy as a harmless eccentric. She had achieved what seasoned generals had failed to do. She had turned the tide of war, not with cunning strategy, but with unshakable faith. Yet even as France celebrated, seeds of doubt began to take root. Was Jeanne truly a messenger of God? Or was she a dangerous fanatic whose success might one day threaten the authority of king and clergy alike? Such questions would linger, shadowing her triumphs to come. But for now, in the spring of 1429, she was the Maid of Orléans, savior of France, a figure who had risen from obscurity to stand radiant upon the stage of history. The victory at Orléans had done more than lift a siege. It had revived a nation's broken spirit. For the first time in decades, the French dared to believe that deliverance was possible. Jeanne, once dismissed as a village dreamer, now stood at the center of France's hopes. Yet her mission, as she declared from the outset, was not merely to win battles. It was to see Charles, the Dauphin, crowned king at Reims. Why Reims? The question mattered. For centuries, the Cathedral of Reims had been the traditional site of French coronations, where kings were anointed with holy oil said to have been brought by a dove from heaven itself. To be crowned at Reims was to be recognized not merely as ruler by law, but as monarch by divine sanction. Without that sacred right, Charles remained only a claimant. With it, he would be transformed into Charles VII, rightful King of France. The journey to Reims, however, was fraught with peril. The city lay deep in territory controlled by the English and their Burgundian allies. To march there would mean traversing hostile lands, risking ambush, and confronting well-fortified towns. Many of Charles's advisors urged caution. Was it not wiser to consolidate gains, to negotiate, to wait? Jean's answer was uncompromising. "In God's name, we must go!" And so the royal army set forth, with Jean riding at the Dauphin's side, her banner held aloft. To the astonishment of many, towns along the route opened their gates without resistance. At Troyes, a formidable Burgundian stronghold, the garrison hesitated. Jean, unflinching, urged an immediate assault. The town surrendered without a fight. It seemed as if walls and spears melted before her conviction. By July 1429, the procession reached Reims itself. The citizens, swayed by the tide of victories and fearful of opposing a movement that seemed touched by heaven, opened their gates. On the 17th of July, within the soaring Gothic arches of Reims Cathedral, Charles knelt before the altar. The archbishop anointed him with the sacred chrism, and the Dauphin of uncertain legitimacy rose as Charles VII, crowned and consecrated King of France. The moment was one of profound symbolism. For years, the English had claimed that Charles was disinherited, a bastard prince unfit to rule. Now, before the eyes of nobles, clergy, and the people, he bore the crown of his ancestors, his authority sanctified by God's church. Jeanne stood beside him, her white banner unfurled, tears upon her cheeks. "Gentle king," she said, "now is fulfilled the will of God, who desired that you should come to Reims and be consecrated." For the French, it was nothing less than a rebirth. The Maid of Orléans had not only saved a city, she had given France back its king. Songs were sung, bells pealed, and in villages far from the battlefield, peasants whispered of the miraculous maiden who had changed the course of history. Yet beneath the jubilation, shadows lengthened. Charles, though crowned, remained hesitant and cautious. The English were far from defeated, the Burgundians still hostile. And within the royal court, jealousy and suspicion began to fester. Who was this peasant girl who stood so close to the king? Was she a saint or a dangerous rival to established authority? Such doubts, once planted, would grow. But in that summer of 1429, none could deny her triumph. Jeanne had accomplished what no general, no noble, no diplomat could achieve. She had restored a crown, and, with it, a nation's faith in its own destiny. The coronation at Reims was Jeanne's zenith. She had accomplished what seemed impossible. She had taken a hesitant prince, delivered him through enemy lands, and placed the crown of France upon his head. For the common people, she was a saint in armor, the maid chosen by God. Yet in the hushed chambers of Charles's court, where ambition and caution held sway, her dazzling ascent stirred unease. To the soldiers who had fought at Orléans, Jeanne was a comrade, a standard-bearer whose courage had rekindled their spirit. To the peasants, she was a miracle, a figure sent from heaven to redeem their suffering. But to certain nobles and clerics, she was an anomaly, a peasant girl in a world rigidly ordered by rank and bloodline. How could such a one presume to stand at the king's side, to speak with authority, to issue commands that seasoned lords obeyed? Charles himself, though grateful, was a man of wavering will. The coronation had strengthened his claim, but it had not transformed his nature. He was cautious, indecisive, and easily swayed by advisers. Where Jeanne urged bold action, a march on Paris, the heart of enemy power, Charles hesitated. His counselors whispered prudence, treaties, negotiations. They warned him that to place too much trust in a teenage girl was folly, perhaps even heresy. Nevertheless, Jeanne pressed forward. In September 1429, she led an assault on Paris. But this time, fortune did not favor her. The city, heavily garrisoned by the English and Burgundians, resisted fiercely. Jeanne was wounded in the leg by a crossbow bolt, yet she refused to abandon the field until carried away by her companions. The attack faltered. Charles, ever reluctant, soon called a retreat. For the first time, the Maid had tasted defeat. The failure at Paris gave fresh ammunition to her detractors. Whispers began to circulate. Was she truly guided by God? Or had the devil's hand been at work all along? Some clerics muttered that her insistence on wearing male attire was unseemly, even sinful. Others, jealous of her influence, spread rumors that she was prideful, that she sought glory beyond her station. At the same time, political winds shifted. Charles, now crowned, grew less reliant on the Maid. Courtiers maneuvered to distance the king from her, fearful that her charisma might eclipse his fragile authority. Jeanne, once welcomed into councils of war, found herself excluded. Her voice, once heeded as divine command, was treated with polite indifference. Yet she did not abandon her mission. In 1430, she rode north to defend Compiègne against Burgundian forces. There, on 23 May, her fate was sealed. Leading a sortie from the city, she fought with her customary bravery, rallying her men amidst the chaos. But as the French retreated through the gates, they closed before she could enter. Surrounded, she was dragged from her horse and taken prisoner by the Burgundians. The capture of Jeanne d'Arc sent shockwaves across France. For her followers, it was an unspeakable calamity. How could God's chosen maid fall into enemy hands? For her enemies, it was a priceless prize. The chance to break the myth, to prove that the so-called saint was nothing more than a deluded girl. And for Charles VII, the king whose crown she had secured, it was a moment of shameful hesitation. Would he move heaven and earth to ransom his savior? Or would he, cautious as ever, turn away, leaving her to face her captors alone? When Jeanne was seized outside Compiègne in May 1430, it was as though the breath had been stolen from France. The Maid of Orléans, the girl who had walked unscathed through storms of arrows and flames of battle, was at last undone not by enemy swords but by the closing of a city gate. Betrayal seemed to hang in the air. Whether deliberate or accidental, the effect was the same. She was alone, surrounded, dragged from her horse, and bound by Burgundian soldiers. At first, many assumed that King Charles would hasten to ransom her. Such was the custom of the age. Knights and nobles, once captured, were rarely slain outright. Instead, they were held for ransom, and their kin or sovereigns would pay dearly to secure their release. Jeanne had not merely served Charles. She had won him his crown. Surely he would move swiftly to reclaim her? But no such rescue came. Charles VII remained silent. His counselors, wary of her influence, whispered that the maid had served her purpose. With his coronation achieved, what further need had he of the peasant girl who unsettled courtiers and stirred suspicions amongst the clergy? Whether from indifference, cowardice, or deliberate calculation, the king did nothing. Meanwhile, the Burgundians knew her worth. They held her for several months, parading her as a trophy, before deciding to sell her to the English for a handsome sum of 10,000 livres. The English, still smarting from the humiliation of Orléans and Reims, seized upon the opportunity. To them, Jeanne was more than a captive. She was a threat to their claim upon France, a symbol whose destruction was as valuable as any fortress won. In December 1430, she was delivered to Rouen, the English stronghold in Normandy. There, behind high stone walls, she was imprisoned in a dank cell, guarded by soldiers who treated her as both curiosity and criminal. Unlike noble prisoners, who might be granted comfort and relative dignity, Jeanne was chained, deprived of female attendance, and subjected to the taunts of her captors. She was 19 years old. News of her plight spread quickly. For her supporters, it was a scandal beyond words. How could France abandon the maid? For her enemies, it was a triumph. The figure who had inspired so many was now caged, her destiny no longer her own. Yet in the midst of despair, Jeanne herself did not falter. Witnesses would later recall how she continued to pray, to speak of her voices, to insist that her mission was not ended. It was then that her true trial began, not upon the battlefield, but in the court of the church. For the English were determined not merely to kill her, but to discredit her, to brand her as a heretic, a witch, a blasphemer, so that her victories might be seen not as miracles of God, but as deceptions of the devil. To achieve this, they enlisted the machinery of ecclesiastical law. Thus, the stage was set for one of the most infamous trials in history, a proceeding where politics wore the robes of piety, and where the fate of a girl would serve as a weapon in the War of Nations. Rouen, winter 1431. Within the stone walls of its fortress, Jeanne d'Arc was led to face a tribunal unlike any ordinary court of law. This was no mere inquiry into her conduct. It was a trial staged to destroy her. The English sought not simply her death, but her discredit. For so long as she remained a saint in the eyes of the people, their conquest of France would be haunted by her legend. She must be shown to be no saint at all, but a heretic, a sorceress, a liar. The presiding judge was Bishop Pierre Cauchon of Beauvais, a man in the service of English interests. Learned clerics and scholars were summoned, not to weigh truth impartially, but to entrap and condemn. Gina, still only 19, stood alone, without counsel, without allies, facing weeks of relentless interrogation. Day after day, they pressed her with questions designed to ensnare. Who spoke to her in those visions? What garments did they wear? What words did they utter? Did she believe she was in God's grace? This last was a cunning trap. To answer yes would be arrogance, condemned as heresy. To answer no would be an admission of guilt. Jeanne, unlettered but quick of wit, replied with disarming simplicity, "If I am not in God's grace, may He place me there. If I am, may He keep me there." Even her interrogators marveled at her composure. They dwelt upon her attire. Why did she wear the dress of a man? Jeanne explained that it was for modesty, to protect herself amongst soldiers and gaolers. But to her accusers, it was an abomination, a violation of Scripture, a visible sign of defiance against the order of creation. In truth, it was a convenient charge, one that could be paraded as proof of obstinacy. Through it all, Jeanne clung to her voices. She did not recant their guidance. She did not renounce her mission. She spoke of St. Michael, of St. Catherine, of St. Margaret, as though they had visited her the night before. Her calm conviction unsettled her judges, yet it also steeled their resolve. If she would not bend, then she must be broken. At length, the verdict was inevitable. After months of questioning, they declared her guilty of heresy and witchcraft. Yet, under threat of the stake, she signed an abjuration, a document renouncing her voices and promising obedience to the Church. It was a moment of unbearable pressure, the will of a teenage girl crushed by the weight of earthly power. She was sentenced to life imprisonment. But even in defeat, the fire within her had not gone out. Within days, she resumed her male clothing, perhaps in defiance, perhaps in despair at being denied female attendance. To her judges, this was proof of relapse. Her heresy had returned. The English demanded the ultimate sentence. Thus the trial reached its grim conclusion. Jeanne, once the Maid of Orléans who had led armies and crowned a king, was condemned to burn at the stake. Her voices had brought her to triumph. Now they would carry her to martyrdom. On the morning of 30 May 1431, the city of Rouen stirred with a grim anticipation. Word had spread. The Maid of Orléans would die that day. From every quarter, people gathered, townsfolk, soldiers, clerics, English captains, to witness the end of a girl whose very existence had defied kings and armies. Jeanne was led from her cell by the guards. She wore a simple white gown, her cropped hair uncovered, her hands bound. In the courtyard she paused, asking for a crucifix. A sympathetic English soldier fashioned a small cross from 2 sticks and gave it to her. She clutched it tightly, whispering prayers as she was taken to the marketplace where the stake awaited. The scaffold had been raised high, so that all could see. Piled with wood and straw, it loomed over the crowd like a dreadful altar. As Jeanne mounted the steps, she asked again for a cross to be held before her eyes. One was brought from the nearby church of Saint-Sauveur, and a compassionate friar lifted it aloft so that she might gaze upon the image of Christ as the sentence was carried out. The judges read the condemnation. The crowd murmured, some jeering, others weeping. Jeanne, her voice steady, declared once more that her voices had come from God, not from the devil. She begged forgiveness of those she had wronged and prayed aloud for the King of France. Then, with the firewood stacked around her feet, the torch was set to the kindling. Flames leapt and smoke curled into the morning air. As the fire rose, Jeanne cried the name of Jesus again and again. Eyewitnesses testified that her faith did not falter, even as the smoke choked her voice and the fire consumed her body. When at last she fell silent, the executioner raked back the flames so that none could doubt she was dead. At the English commander's order, her remains were reduced to ashes and cast into the Seine, so that no relic might be claimed, no shrine erected. They thought to erase her memory, but memory is not so easily destroyed. News of her death spread swiftly, and with it a tide of sorrow and outrage. To her enemies she had been a witch. To her people she became a martyr. In the years that followed, as France slowly pushed back the English and secured its independence, the name of Jeanne d'Arc grew ever brighter. The girl who had once walked from Domrémy with nothing but conviction was transformed into a legend. 2 decades later, even the church that had condemned her began to waver. In 1456, a retrial ordered by Pope Calixtus III overturned the verdict of Rouen, declaring her innocent and proclaiming that she had been wrongfully executed. Centuries after her death, in 1920, the Catholic Church canonized her as Saint Joan of Arc. And so her story, which began in the obscurity of a peasant village, ended in the pantheon of the saints. She had lived but 19 years. Yet in that brief span she altered the fate of a kingdom, restored a crown, and left behind a question that echoes through history. What force is stronger than armies, more enduring than kings? Perhaps it is the unyielding faith of a single soul, aflame with conviction, standing alone against the world.